Hey guys, me Sam Stein, managing editor at the Bulwark, back on a Saturday morning, joined by Bill Kristol. As always, thank you for tuning in. Please subscribe to the feed. We're going to get right into it because, as is usual with the Trump administration, a lot of news happens on Friday night, and this Friday was no different. We had a mass, I guess we could call it mass purge of top military brass, 7 in all, fired by President Trump on Friday night. The biggest name, of course, was General Charles Brown. He's the Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman, 4-star fighter pilot, known as CQ. He was not the only one. We also saw the sacking of Lisa Franchetti. She was the first woman to lead the Navy. The vice chief of the Air Force was also sacked, and then the top lawyers for Army, Navy, and Air Force also sacked. We're going to get into the context in a little bit, but I know you want to say something about CQ Brown first, Bill. So why don't you talk a little bit about this and the role that he played and sort of the legacy that he now leaves?
Well, just on the broad context for 1 second, we're used to people coming in and sacking the leaders of, not sacking, they just resigned, the leaders of the civilian agencies. And, no question that Austin wasn't going to stay as Secretary of Defense when Trump took over, and he put Hegseth in, and Hegseth got confirmed by the Senate. This is very unusual to do this with the military. Right. I mean, now, over time, do you move in officers you think might be better suited to the jobs? Do you think you correct mistakes the preceding administration made? Absolutely. Occasionally, you make it a more abrupt change in the middle of a war. That happened a bit during the Iraq War, for example. This is quite extraordinary. And in fact, Trump said in his statement that these were all fine people. CQ Brown had served the country very well. So what was the urgency in replacing him? The CQ Brown wasn't going to disobey Trump's orders to try to downsize the civilians at the Defense Department.
In fact, it's quite the opposite. He found out he had been terminated when he was down in the border because he was executing on Trump's desired mission to put more military resources towards border security. So he had been dutiful soldier when he was sacked.
Right. Don't reappoint him for a second 2-year term. There were a million. Anyway, the abruptness of it, the willingness to just ignore norms, not laws, but norms about how and when one replaces military leaders, not again the civilian people there or elsewhere, even in the Justice Department and so forth, is pretty extraordinary. Just on CQ Brown for a second, I'm reporting what people I trust have told me. People I trust who served in the Reagan administration and other Republican administrations and aren't big fans of DEI programs in general, that is one of the real slanders against General Brown. Extremely impressive man, apparently very open-minded, a reformer within the military who was making the Air Force. Trump made him, incidentally, Chief of Staff of the Air Force in the first Trump term. He then becomes chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Very much involved in updating the military's understanding of technology. Had been in command of air assets in the Pacific, so very much involved in the pivot to the Indo-Pacific and to taking on China. So from any kind of rational point of view, he's a guy you would want there for this moment in foreign policy and national security policy. And even according to Trump's own and Musk's, I guess, own desire to make it more high-tech and more adaptable and all that, that's what Brown was partly about innovation and so forth. And again, move him out after 6 months, sure. But this kind of firing of him, really bad and a terrible precedent, but also just totally unfair. Hegseth attacked him as a DEI appointee. You know what the explanation for that is? Racism. Hegseth knows nothing. There's not, and I looked at the book for a second, and you've looked at that book more than I have, I think, for your sins. There's zero explanation. There's not like, this guy was obviously bumped up over other people, which is total nonsense. He had served a long time. He had been promoted. In accord with normal promotion things, and Trump made him chairman of the Air Force.
Yeah, and so the context here is, so when Trump did appoint him chairman of the Air Force, head of the Air Force, he did actually go out of his way to note the historic nature of the appointment. He said, this is the first black person who's held this title. This was the first Trump administration. Hegseth, in his book and on subsequent podcasts, called for his removal. He said he has to be fired. His explanation was not so much that Brown was black, although that was obviously, part of it. It was that Brown had focused too much of his stewardship at the Joint Chiefs on DEI initiatives, on getting more recruitment from minority communities. And that was where Hegseth came down. It is notable that in the brief time since Hegseth has been confirmed, that they have been getting along or working together. And this was kind of, I mean, it was anticipated, but it was also sort of very much abrupt and out of the blue to a degree. Like I said, Brown was in some hotel in Texas when he got the call, according to reports.
And just one last thing on the kind of details. I think the bigger picture is more important. But
sure,
the person who's being promoted, I don't know much about him, and certainly not going to opine without.
There's a guy named Dan Cain.
Dan Cain, nickname
that
Raisin.
Trump seems to love because
Trump loves the
praised
nickname.
Trump. Yeah, exactly.
Raisin
He likes the
Cain,
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Trump tells stories about him, which may or may not be true, incidentally, about things he said to Trump, and the one or two times they met, apparently in 2018, 19. He's been involved. He left the Air Force to go into the Air Force Guard for a few years and got involved in some Silicon Valley stuff. And was involved in a firm run by, I think, Jared Kushner's brother, right, Josh Kushner and stuff. So there's some relation. He may know some of the sort of Silicon Valley people who are influential with Trump, which is fine. I mean, maybe or maybe not. We don't know. So I'm not going to opine on Cain except to say that to take someone who's been retired and bump him up at a 3-star and has never been in charge of either one of the services, as Brown, let's say, was chief of the Air Force, or in charge of a region as a combatant commander, is the law says you should have one of those two qualifications to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Now, you can override that. The president can have
and you could get a waiver.
Could get a waiver. But which again brings home how extraordinary this is. He has to go out and get a waiver for the person he's bringing in to jump over an awful lot of active duty 4-stars, including the currently serving chief, about whom there were no complaints, so to speak. So again, he's going out of his way to pick General Cain.
So let's talk about that. I mean, so the question obviously is why? Why do it, right? Yeah. Like, and we can let's guess. We're guessing, right? But I think we have reasonable context and history to inform our guesses here.
So I don't know this. I think people are focused a lot on the individuals, and I guess my broader point would be General Cain owes everything to Donald Trump. Right? He's not a guy who already was there when Trump took over. So he may be a perfectly decent and fine public servant and want to do the right thing, but still, his attitude is going to be more that, I'm going to put it this way, of Marco Rubio or Michael Waltz, both of whom were not regarded as particularly Trumpy when they were in the Senate and the House, respectively. Right. But as Secretary of State, look at what Rubio's doing, and it's because he's totally dependent on and owes everything to Trump. So I think Trump wants people who owe everything to him in there. He wants loyalists. And I do think it's the overall message.
Well, talk a bit, Bill. Talk a bit about how the Mark Milley history probably informs Trump's view of this.
Well, it's interesting, because he picked Milley, and wasn't it right after the Army-Navy game? I have some vague memory of that being involved.
I'll have to look that one up.
Remember that at Thanksgiving of 2018, and he went to the game. Maybe Milley went with him. I can't remember. I mean, at the time, the people I knew who sort of followed this stuff closely. Milley wasn't the consensus choice to be chairman. I think people thought the Air Force Chief of Staff, Goldfein, I think his name was more impressive. But whatever, and Milley was chair, and certainly was Army Chief of Staff. He was qualified. I think Trump thought he was appointing a loyalist, and it turned out Milley stood up to Trump famously, obviously. Right. Made a mistake at Lafayette Square, but then stood up to him after November 3rd and privately before November 3rd as well, and worked with Pompeo and with Esper to stop some really bad things from happening. And I think the lesson Trump learned from that is Milley looked like, at the time in 2018, some of my friends thought Milley's kind of sucking up to Trump a little bit. I mean, he sort of wants he wants Trump to pick him. Understandable, I suppose. Trump liked the way he looked. The lesson Trump learned is you really need someone who has no independent standing. I think that's the key point. You need someone who doesn't have his own network. C.Q. Brown knew a lot of people, and he'd been around for a long time. He'd been at senior levels. He knew the defense community, the national security community. He wasn't going to simply assume that if Trump said X, there were no other points of view worth at least entertaining or recommending to Trump as the advisor to Trump and so forth. Cain hasn't been in that situation. He served in the Biden administration, amusingly enough, as the top military guy over at the CIA. There's a position at the CIA, quite senior, where you're the kind of liaison, in effect, with the military. And he worked closely with Bill Burns, Biden's CIA director. So it's not as if he's a raging MAGA person, presumably, but he doesn't have the kind of independent standing that even Milley had, let alone C.Q. Brown. And I think that's key in Trump's mind.
Hey, YouTube fam, if you want to support The Bulwark, the best way to do it is by becoming a YouTube Bulwark Plus member. The Bulwark is truly independent. We have no corporate overlords. We're not settling any dumb lawsuits with Trump. By joining, you help support our work, and you can get a bunch of perks right here on this platform. Ad-free content, bonus videos, live streams, and some emojis of me, which I guess some people want. So come join, come hang out, become a Bulwark YouTube Plus member, and I'll be seeing you in the comments. So behave.
Right. And from how I view it is that Trump really got angry with Milley for speaking out. And also the Lafayette Square incident where Milley was very upset about the use of National Guard to go and basically suppress protesters. Of course, obviously speaking out about what happened on January 6th. And for Trump, ultimately it just comes down to loyalty, right? It's like, do you feel like this guy is going to be loyal to you? And if he stops being loyal to you, kick him to the curb. And so Trump 2.0 is sort of built around this idea that we are going to just start fresh and bring in all the loyalists so that we can at least start by trusting him. And that is certainly looks to be the case in this situation. Now, just before we go, the response, the retort from the Trump people online to any criticism of this is that this is totally kosher. I think no one's arguing that it's illegal or anything. You can do this. It's just not within the norms. But also they're like, well, Truman sacked MacArthur, Obama sacked McChrystal. Like this happens all the time. In fact, those are two very unique situations that have no relation to what we're talking about here because those actually had, pretext to the reasons that they were fired. Yeah, exactly. So talk a little about that. I mean, do you see any historical parallel or no?
Pretty hard to find one. I mean, I think what this is truly about, I'll just make 2 quick points, is breaking all institutional resistance to Trump. I mean, if you put it together, what happened to the Justice Department and the FBI and National Intelligence, he wants the power agencies to be utterly responsive to him, loyal to him, beyond loyal, to have fealty to him. And that's part of this. Now, that's not to say that Kane might not surprise him, but that's what he's doing his best to move in that direction. And then final point, the firing.
They're taking no chances. Just don't take
firing
a chance.
the JAGs, that I believe is totally unprecedented. These are the top lawyers, obviously, in each of the services. They each have their own. What are the rationales they're using? And the media, I'd say, has bought this a little too much, in my opinion, from skimming the news this morning. That he wants people who are on charge in sync with the America First agenda. Well, the JAGs aren't in sync with the. He doesn't know whether the JAGs are in sync with the America First agenda or the Bush agenda or the Biden agenda. They're JAGs, right? They're lawyers who opine on whether, among other things, whether orders to enforce, obviously, the laws help, supervise the enforcement of laws within the military, including against some of the war criminals.
I mean, Hegseth has been fairly upfront about that, too. He wants to get rid of people who he thinks unnecessarily constrain military force. I think he's sort of an apologist for some of the worst features that the military can pursue. And so that is a way to get rid of those roadblocks.
Totally. So part of it is these people, presided over a system that found some of the people that Trump pardoned, to be war criminals.
Who Hegseth was friends with.
Right?
Yeah.
But also, even more broadly, these are the people who would have to say if an order came down that was questionable, using troops in the U.S., Insurrection Act, all the obvious things, the stuff that Milley was balking at and working very hard to prevent. These are the people who would say this is a lawful order, or no, I have real questions about this, and at least I'm going to go to the Secretary of Defense and say that, in my opinion, members of the Air Force or the Army or the Navy should at least have questions about obeying this order, or we need to bring it back up to the President and say it's not. He does not want independent. They don't want independent. For me, that's very ominous because, again, there's not even a pretense that the JAGs have a point of view about, I don't know, whether we should do more with China or whether we should sell out Ukraine. No, it's not about that.
It's just interpretation of the law.
It's pure, I don't want any obstacles. It's more like the Justice Department, if you want,
right.
Or like that. I don't want any obstacles to personal loyalty to me in any of these top positions.
Yeah. Well, it's ominous, but to be honest, it's all ominous. And so it kind of fits into the general vibe. And so I'm not I'm not totally thrown off by this. I'm stewing in it.
Maybe it's a bit of a wake-up call of how ominous things are. I do think there's been a little bit of that going on. You've reported on this a lot in the last few days in terms of what Musk has been up to. A little bit of a wake-up about that. Maybe now the military, there are a lot of people.
Well, I would say so. But then you had Roger Wicker, who was head of the Armed Services Committee, put out a statement last night and no objection whatsoever to it, right? I mean, he was just like, okay, cool. And so you get to the place where we've been continuously, you and I, where it's like, well, what's the point of these people? Like, why did you run for office? You know, like, at what point do you actually want to, exert some independence or take your job seriously? And we're not quite there yet. So,
A good question. A good question.
All right, Bill, thanks so much for waking up and doing this. Appreciate it. And thank you guys for tuning in and watching us. Again, do subscribe to the feed. We really appreciate it. And we'll be in touch. Bye.